I'm just going to tell you a little bit about who our speaker is today. Jess Rubin is an ecological reconciliation researcher and the founder of MycoEvolve. Through research, earthworks, and education, Jess works to remediate degraded urban, suburban, and agricultural landscapes. Her skills include, but are not limited to, research into plant and fungal life cycles, culturing fungi on diverse natural substrates, as well as being a generally kind and actively compassionate human being. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Garrett.
Sorry, just got that in there. Thank you for joining, Jess. This is the Climate Change Resilience Zoom call. It's presented by Extinction Rebellion DC. And my little subtitle to the title of this event is Climate Change Resilience from Ecological Reconciliation to Self-Care.
Yes, thank you, Garrett and Extinction Rebellion DC and the First Nation people of that land. I stand here on what's called Nadakana by the Abenaki people, people of the Dawn Land. Colonial name is called Vermont. And a lot of this work is dedicated to the rematriation and reclaimed sovereignty of those people and all First Nation people around the world, as well as descendants of slaves and all marginalized communities.
I want to just give, I'm going to tell the briefest story of how I met Jess. Jess at her home had a fairly large-sized backyard garden, and key to note was that Jess was doing sheet mulching, or also known as lasagna gardening, if you will. She had taken the opportunity to layer different types of decomposing material, or organic material, so that she was planting directly into those layered materials. And what she was planting that one day was garlic. And that was the first time I had ever planted garlic. And I did so with a friend that I met on that day. And I just remember puncturing through a layer of cardboard, a layer of leaves, a layer of compost, and just one after another. I'm not sure if we planted 30 or 100 cloves of garlic, but just going one after another through these rows. And that was our day's work. And just, I got to see more of her garden space. I saw her compost bins at the site. And overall, it was just really eye-opening for me. And it was the start of what clearly is an ongoing relationship and exchange. And I continue to be humbled by the work that Jess is doing because it continues to educate me. Jess, I wanted to take this seamless opportunity after just describing more of our origin. You mentioned rehabilitation work. And I'm curious if you can describe the work that you're currently doing.
Sure. So I think I want to just bring it back to the framework of colonization, that if you think about at least this Turtle Island continent we're on, the fact that it was founded, in this way of displacing thousands to millions of people that had really well-developed societies and a very sort of regenerative way of navigating with the landscape. And so everything on top of that has evolved in colonization and civilization, industrialization, is off because the means shape the end. And so what I see now when I look around, most landscapes is just pain, layers of trauma, not just the attempted and sometimes, the attempted genocide, because it wasn't full, thank goodness, of these First Nation people, and then slavery brought over, and kind of those layers of trauma that have happened on the landscape as well. And so, Doug Tallamy, entomologist mentor, talks about how, 95% of land is degraded, and that's ridiculous. And so every area really could benefit from some TLC, some loving care and different forms of helping kind of regenerate. And I used to use the word restore, and I still really, bow my head to the field of ecological restoration, because they've worked very hard to get into the realm of science to bring some of this rehabilitation work to a field where it can inform policy. But you can't ever restore. You can't replace the attempted genocide and then the idea of property and the depth of megafauna, and then the domestication of animals, and then the degraded soil and then the degraded watershed. So we can't restore it, but we can reconcile the damage, and we can start to heal it and just bring in things that will jumpstart autogenic repair. And as we do that with the soil, we're also doing it with ourselves and our relationships and our ancestral trauma. And as a person with white skin, the privilege I have and, you know, the parts I need to own and try to dismantle white supremacy and patriarchy and all the other parts of that. And so in terms of micromediation, it's been a really wonderful opportunity to learn more from the queendom, as one of my mentors, Sue Van Hook, introduced fungi to me as. You know, they've been on the planet, according to Western science, right? Not all traditions hold this timeline, but according to Western science, the Earth is 4.6 billion years. Fungi, you know, microbes show up 3 to 4 billion years, and fungi show up 2 billion years, and plants 1 billion years. And, you know, we two-leggeds don't show up till maybe 50,000 years, right? So not only are we such newbies in the block, but these creatures, these species, these organisms have been involved in deep collaboration of nutrient exchange networks and creating ecosystems for billions of years before we got there. And so there's these deep relationships, this deep wisdom, these deep networks that if we can humble ourselves to tap into as the new kid on the block and listen and learn and replicate and try to create spaces for them to come in, then a lot of repair can just happen. You know, they say a good leader is someone who kind of empowers others and gets out of the way. And so that's kind of, you know, my aim in some of the research projects I'm doing in areas where I live, where a lot of land practices, terrestrial land practices, end up hurting the watershed. And so that ecotone between water and land, putting in buffers that have with ancient species and ancient species combinations that can jumpstart not only below ground ancient relationships, but also above ground relationships. Doug Tallamy talks a lot about how these relationships of plant lineages and insects, that they are 100 to 1,000-year-old long. And so when we don't create enough habitat for those particular plants, those species can't show up and do their magic. So creating spaces for those species to come back. And similarly, below ground, mycorrhizae, the oldest fossil of mycorrhizae, which is a type of fungi, is 400 million years old and was found in Rhynchurt in Scotland. And I mean, that's been around. And so bringing some of those back in the soil, where soil networks have been ripped apart, and allowing the enzymes of those fungi to release their exudates and grow soil aggregation and hold water and filter and partner with, you know, 20 to 70 different species at once. And not to mention, they're symbiotically connected to the bacteria and the plants. And so it's really just sort of like re-inviting in community after devastation.
And I greatly appreciate that, because there were a couple of words that jumped out to me that have been kind of, if you will, playing my heart like a chime these past few years. Words like relationship and words like partner or partnering, and also, again, community as well. And it seems like, you know, using words like healing as well, we'll get to broader aspects of healing that are so direly needed. It seems as well an aspect of healing that's needed is to remember the reconnection, or to remember the ongoing connection to, as you mentioned, fungi, plants, trees, the more than human world. I'm curious if you can describe for us, as we're all two-leggeds here in this call, if you can describe for us more of the ongoing relationships that fungi, plants, trees have with our daily lives as humans.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I would say in some ways they're like the ecological janitors of the planet. And I don't know if people are familiar with Bread and Puppet. It's kind of like a Vermont-centered, well, actually, they go international. They do all sorts of puppet shows and things, but they have the garbage people and that are always like cleaning up, and they're like the heroes, you know, but they're the unsung heroes. You know, garbage people are heroes and recyclers, but often they're not respected for some reason in our weird society. But you know, microbes and fungi in a lot of ways, they're continually recycling. You know, they're taking dead matter and they're turning it into nutrients. What's amazing about fungi is they have the ability to take very complex molecules and break them down into food for microbes or bring them into a form that plants can uptake the nutrients. They can take toxins that are human, made of different elements and sort of disassemble them to a certain level, degrade them, and then hand them off to, bacteria that will then do the next level. And in plants, there's certain fungi like mycorrhizae, which is that I mentioned, that 400 million year old category. There's a couple different types, endo and ecto. One lives around the root of plants and one goes inside the root of plants. And they have the ability, if there's a soil that's heavy metal laden, they have the ability to sequester those heavy metals and hold them in place. And the plant can access all the nutrients it needs and still grow. And that you could harvest the plant and not take up the metal. And then there's other ones that will take up the metal in their biomass. And so it's just fascinating to see how they are sort of like the backbone of our existence. And then above ground, if you think about the pollinators and you think about all the different birds and all the different mammals and reptiles, amphibians that are cycling nutrients. And they don't do things like, well, occasionally they do, maybe beavers do, but they don't poop in drinking water as much as humans do. And, their urine does, they're cycling, their loops are tighter. And that's something that we can learn from. And they don't need to extract so much to survive. And so in a lot of ways, they're teachers and role models for us, and kind of, let's get back, back in a Earth community membership form.
I'm curious if you can describe some of the method that you use in doing sheet mulching at your garden, and how that incorporates these cycles, these tighter loops as you described.
Sure. So a lot of land is covered in this monoculture of grass, right? Short roots, water isn't held much, nutrients, there's not too much nutrient exchange, there's often not much of a soil sponge. And so when we put down cardboard that doesn't have dyes in it, or chemicals, it's really a layer of carbon, and cover it with leaves. And over time, that grass will die, and the microbes will see that carbon as food. It's really just comes down to biochemical. It's food for them. And when we're able to do that with other leaves and maybe add a tiny bit of compost, though I don't emphasize compost too much because it's high in phosphorus, and that ends up in the water if you don't have good buffers and good nutrient cycling, then over time, you're bringing an area back to a space where other life can come in, and different size roots, so after we would maybe get a lawn to sort of start breaking down, then putting in species of different size roots, different length roots that go well together, and maybe ones that bloom at different times, because pollinators really need what's called flower constancy. And depending on, again, if you're growing certain things and you want to have wood chips in your garden paths, there's certain fungi that are secondary decomposers that grow well on wood chips, like you've probably heard of King Stropharia, which is also a good remediator in some ways. That's an easy one you could just grow in your pathways. And then if you're growing more perennial species, you can do mycorrhizae inoculation. And basically there's endo and ecto, depending on which species you're working with, and there's ways to figure out which one it partners with. Some, like willow, partner with both. And what that does, what the mycorrhizae do, is they expand the root zone, the rhizosphere of that tree or shrub. And basically, if you think about a root can only go out as far as it can reach into the soil and mine those nutrients and water. But imagine if that root then has extensions beyond it that are much thinner, that can penetrate way further, and areas that you couldn't formally access. And it could bring in phosphorus, and it could bring in water and micronutrients. And meanwhile, the plant's photosynthesis, about 20% of it is feeding that fungi. And so there's a symbiotic relationship. It's not always symbiotic. Sometimes there's parasitic, or sometimes it shifts during the succession of the ecosystem. But that's just one example of the collaboration.
You mentioned phosphorus, and I'm curious if you can, I forgot to mention where some of the work that I remember you doing, or that I've even had the privilege to participate in, was work of using microremediation to test if you were successful in removing or lowering the levels of phosphorus outside of an agricultural field, a farm field. I'm curious if you can describe that research project and how it's going or how it's evolved for you.
Great, yeah, thank you. So originally I was working with the E. coli and trying to remediate it using certain saprophytes. And we stopped on that because we saw that phosphorus was being released, even though it was decreasing the E. coli. And so that's just a reminder, whenever you do microremediation, you have to think about what are the toxins you're working on. Sometimes there's many of them and you can only focus on one. And then you have to see if what you're doing will not malaffect other parts. So I've gotten, one of my current projects is finally just focused on one nutrient, phosphorus. And as you may recall, phosphorus, while it's an amazing element, unlike nitrogen and carbon, it doesn't have an air cycle. And there's a finite amount of it. It's mostly in the lithosphere, the geosphere, from the earth, from rock. And, you know, it's amazing because it's used as it's a limiting nutrient. Plants need it for all sorts of protein synthesis and bud formation and growth. But what ends up happening is if the phosphorus leaves the land and gets into the water, it can create anoxic conditions, lacking oxygen, and basically facilitate the growth of blue-green algae, because again, it promotes growth. But the blue-green algae will grow so much, and there's some blue-green algae that's helpful, but there's some that aren't. Again, nothing is completely straightforward. But basically what ends up happening is that dies, decomposes, creates a condition of lacking oxygen in the water. A lot of life dies in the water, and it's called eutrophication, and it's actually happening to fresh waters around the world. And so phosphorus is like a really important thing to pay attention to. And if you live by the ocean, it's more nitrogen, but that's phosphorus for fresh water is problematic. And it's always running off land into water because we've kind of debilitated a lot of these buffer zones. So one of the projects I'm working on is at a historic landmark called Shelburne Farms. And what we're studying right now is we found a hot spot on a farm. The problem why it's a hot spot is because there's a compost pile on a hill with no buffer, 50 cubic yards every year. Plus, the field already has legacy phosphorus from the sheep craze that happened in Vermont in the 1800s. And so what's happening is phosphorus is just running into that lake, and we know a tributary. And so how do we create a filtration in this tributary? So what we did is we created a couple different plots. And one of them we restored, there was buckthorn growing there. And that's a whole nother interview or talk that I'm sure many of you have ideas on, that non-native species, sometimes they're ecosystem placeholders, sometimes they're problematic, but in this particular condition, they are decreased the above and below ground diversity significantly. And the two kind of functions of a buffer is that it catches overland material to settle, and it facilitates uptake of nutrients into the microbes, plants, and fungi. And so if you don't have a lot of diversity of plants, you only have buckthorn, it's not going to catch that much. There's not going to be a lot to uptake it. So we removed all the buckthorn, but we used a technique that had no chemicals, and it didn't even remove all the stumps, so the roots didn't get removed. It was just, we learned from this great man, Mike Bald, who wrote in the NOFA magazine recently about this technique. And then we put in all native riparian species that grow in natural communities that we just saw growing, we knew would work. And then one of the plots had been inoculated with mycorrhizae, and one of them hadn't. What we did is we put in lysimeters, which are these wells, because we're trying to see how the water, the soil water changes, because the research indicates that mycorrhizae facilitate the uptake of phosphorus 4 times compared to non-mycorrhizal plants. So that means 4 times of phosphorus would move from the soil into the plants, according to the research. We want to get the data on that and see if that's really the case. There are a lot of caveats to the study. It's only 1 year. The phosphorus cycle's slow. And technically, when you put in buffers, they're very problematic if you do not do what's called phytoextraction. And phytoextraction is a form of phytoremediation where you actually remove the above ground material. Think about harvesting, say, just like herbs for a medicinal perennial garden. You just take a few leaves or sprigs. So coppicing is potentially a harmless practice if it's done well, like willow coppicing. You're just cutting stems of things that will regrow. So that's really another piece that needs to happen, because if you do not coppice your buffer, you might uptake way more phosphorus, but then in the fall, when things, at least in the Northeast, go what's called senescence, and the sap goes to the roots and the leaves turn colors and start to fall off, all that phosphorus gets re-released. Not to mention, it's also happening in the soil. because the microbes are very involved in the phosphorus cycle as well. They capture it up and they release it. And inorganically, the elements, particularly elements like aluminum and iron in the soil, have what's called adsorption sites. If you think about a movie theater with empty seats, and so they have spaces, if you go back to chemistry, high school chemistry, cations, they can capture a lot of that phosphorus if the pH is right. And then if the pH changes, it could re-release. So the project I'm doing will hopefully demonstrate some things, but it's also very short for the amount of time, because sometimes it takes decades. You know, it's like we can't heal things that have taken decades, the problem, in a year or two research, but we can at least start to try to get some clue, maybe a little bit, of what's going on and ways we can help begin, and then help farmers, because farmers could use the willow for biofuel, which is my least favorite option, but they could give it to the Abenaki to make baskets. They could now, with the plastic band bag, become cool to shop with baskets or go to the farmer's market. And I'd like to research other plants like elderberry. You know, if I make elderberries for Food Not Bombs and I harvest all the berries, how much phosphorus will I remove every year, and so on.
And I think it's, I'll invite you to touch on this as well. I think it's important to mention, you know, you mentioned phosphorus and how that was accumulating next to or on farm fields. I'm curious if you can mention how phosphorus will run off of just a residential space, like someone's home or driveway.
Yeah, so there's a concept called legacy phosphorus, which is like from generations, and the soil can only hold so much. And so in a lot of these residential communities, I'm looking out now where I am in this kind of urban homestead at the lawn, there is a lot of residences, you know, with good intentions, want to build gardens, and they get this awesome compost, but the compost is high in phosphorus, and maybe their land has a tilt and their soil sponge isn't well developed, which means that the water doesn't percolate. It doesn't go deep through the layers, but it runs. Or if you have impermeable surfaces, these surfaces that don't breathe, like pavement, which unfortunately is increasing in urban areas. And so what happens when you have impermeable surfaces, the water is just going to pick up everything and bring it down. And so if you use a lot of fertilizer on your lawn or a lot of compost and you don't have a buffer and a big rainstorm, that's just going to run into the nearest watershed.
You know, it's interesting just drawing the parallel just briefly. You mentioned legacy phosphorus, and this is a phrase I started hearing recently, is the term legacy trash, in reference to a group I've worked with for a while called Ward 8 Woods. And what they do is they're removing trash or legacy trash from these forest spaces in areas predominantly or east of the Anacostia River, areas like they're called Ward 7 and 8, Anacostia, Congress Heights. These are areas that are predominantly low income and predominantly, the residents are predominantly Black people. And this legacy trash is just accumulating in layers to the point that it's smothering all the native growth. And you have all these opportunistic plant species that are then just taking over the ecosystem. And it's just an interesting parallel I've seen, seeing how much damage can be done just in the span of, say, 30 years, how much phosphorus or trash can accumulate.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned those communities, because I definitely noticed just the concept of environmental racism, of often, you know, companies and industries are putting themselves in communities that maybe are more marginalized, and maybe those communities are just trying to get by from generational trauma and aren't able to bring in the support they need. And it just happens, whereas in some sort of like white upper middle class community, maybe that wouldn't happen because of the whole not in my backyard syndrome. I think it's interesting to draw the connections with what's happening ecologically with what's happening socially. And legacy phosphorus, legacy trash, legacy colonization, legacy oppression. I mean, it's just different levels of the same wound. And everyone can just tune into whichever level you're connected to, and then connect to the other people on the other levels. And hopefully we can start to clean up that legacy. I think that's part of the work of our generation. You know, many generations, but yeah.
Yeah, and in no small way what we're trying to do with this call, but you know, this is not to put pressure on anybody. Actually just gonna take a second for myself, just to remind myself to breathe. So I'm gonna invite people who are listening just to take a second to breathe. And I appreciate the mention of, you know, it's hard processing such weighty topics such as legacies of harm or layers of trauma. And it's important for myself as a white male to realize that I've lived most of my life without being aware of these legacies of harm or the inherited trauma. When we think of Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color, thinking about just the weight and the inherited harm that is just passed down through generations. And also the same thing when we think ecologically, an area where someone is living, if we're thinking of areas such as Anacostia and Congress Heights in this area, we are seeing systemic racism or environmental racism happen daily, just with the type of living conditions that are forced upon people who live east of the Anacostia River. So this is just my way of referencing, it's a lecture I viewed recently. I haven't had the privilege or pleasure to read her book, but Adrienne Maree Brown had a lecture I watched recently and really appreciated. And there's a phrase that she brought up. This was, it was in reference to, quote, a society that's going so fast and a society that's doing so much. And she references recovering from harm. And that really struck me because I realized that a lot of my path as an environmental advocate wasn't going far enough when I wasn't building the muscle to address ongoing environmental racism. I'm curious if you can mention perhaps your own development with these topics and how you see them playing off each other, what these inroads are.
Yes. Well, first thing is I want to thank you for reminding us to breathe, because oftentimes, especially when I'm doing this research, I get into my head, and that's a very sort of like Western colonial thing. And one of my current teachers is the author of a book, Resmaa Menakem. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing their name, but wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands, which I've just started reading recently. And I love Adrienne, the book. Can you repeat the author you mentioned again, her name?
Adrienne Maree Brown.
Adrienne Maree Brown. I read Emergent Strategies a while ago and really connected with a lot what was said. And I think one of the first things is connecting with our own ancestral tradition. Today, in my ancestral tradition, is Tu B'Av. It's a festival of love, which is why I'm wearing white, because we're supposed to go out in the fields and dance, find our soulmate. But connecting with our ancestral roots and getting grounded in what did our ancestors do? Whose land are we on? What level of privilege or lack of privilege, or both, that we're holding? And then who's in your community? And where are they and what do they need? And it's, again, not this sort of white saviorism or neocolonialism, or if you're, a person of color or a new immigrant and trying to deal with the oppressions from, a different side. It's kind of finding allies and finding ways to share power and support each other, because we're all on the same team. We're actually on the Earth team. And there's just a part of our species that has gone a little amok. And so, yeah, I'm continually trying to learn about ways to dismantle white privilege and ways to harness the strength of my ancestral tradition, which even that was trained how to rewire that to pre-patriarchal version of that and bring up the divine feminine. And the calendar that my ancestors follow is lunar, and I take a day of rest every week. I really love the nap ministry. If people haven't heard of it, look it up. It's amazing, really brilliant woman who was so tired while she was researching the stories of her slave ancestors and realized that she needed to sleep for them, and then realized we all need to take more naps, and that overworking and overdoing just feeds the capitalist exploitative hurting the earth machine. And things like Soulfire Farm, organizations like Soulfire Farm that are actively putting land in the hands of Black and Brown Latinx people, modeling the redistribution, kind of like these nutrient cycles. Those are models that I look to and try to emulate and support and give money to and donate, and working with local First Nation people. We're hoping to have a ceremony here on one of our restoration sites with local First Nation people who want to practice their songs and traditions more, and find ways for them to be paid to do that, because until capitalism dies, people have to pay bills.
I hear that, unfortunately. I hear that. I'm just going to casually circle back just briefly. You mentioned the phrase "finding allies," and at the start of our conversation, you're mentioning a lot of, or we are mentioning healing our mindset and relearning how we are just in an ongoing relationship, unapologetic relationship with everything around us, every life form around us. And I'm curious if you can describe, just in your own experience, maybe some of your favorite, I'll say plant allies, fungal tree allies that you would just love to hold space with. And
Yes, I would definitely mention oysters. There's so many different type of oyster mushrooms. The fact that they eat lignin and cellulose in trees and then can break down hydrocarbons. There's some that actually eat plastic that I really want to work with. They're also high in protein and can feed people. Reishi has just been a tremendous ally for me because it helps bring balance, like when I drink it in tea, to my body, and has helped people with more serious diseases and has tremendous remediation potential. Lion's mane, another fungi that just helps the nervous system and the brain and just looks like what it does, really helping nourish those networks, those neural networks. In terms of plants, willow continues to just be such an ally in her ability to purify water and is an early pollinator. And Joe Pyeweed and boneset, other riparian species that provide habitat for pollinators. And nettle, with her amazing stings, is just such a teacher of protection, but deep medicine and healthy boundaries. I could go on. There's so many.
I'll give you another minute or two to continue to go on.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. Burdock. Like, I love burdock. You know, it's just everyone, the Waldorf parents get annoyed with the burrs and the homemade sweaters, but burdock's root goes deep. You'll see, and when you mentioned these opportunist plants showing up, well, they're showing up to these areas because they know it's polluted and they can handle it. And burdock can clean your liver. And it's also just so delicious. And in areas in China, grandmothers use it as a basic foundation for their soup. And dandelion is just the greens in the spring, just purify the winter away, and the blossoms and the root, again, another bitter kidney and kidney tonifier and liver cleanser. Elderberry is just amazing. It grows in riparian zones, pollinator, and it's antiviral. I think it would be wonderful, important medicine for coronavirus in some ways. I know there's some contraindications. It's complicated, but just been amazing. To red clover. For me, heal all, self-heal. Prunella vulgaris is just this amazing plant that shows up on ecotones of fields and meadows and gardens, and it creates kind of an emotional healing energy, both in flower essences and tea. Calendula just keeps blooming. You can use it in salves. Children, it's really good for bringing away the winter blues and when you drink it in the winter in tea.
One thing I wanted that came to my mind as you were speaking, you were mentioning all of these incredible allies that you listed, and for myself as well, I've learned some of these allies from you. I've helped harvest some of these allies, and some of these names I didn't recognize, and I continue to learn. But what was striking for me was that it was almost a sense of grief when I realized that the people who I live nearby, family members, friends, who don't know any of these allies at all. And I'm broadening this as well, where, just to quote another person I watch lectures, Bell Hooks. I recommend people finding lectures online, Bell Hooks. The phrase, the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy, the tragedy that comes just in my own life is that it seems to alienate us from our friends, our more than human friends and our physical human friends. And that's something that I think is important for us to address in the ongoing harm, the legacy of the harm that is keeping us from this broader sphere of interrelationship exchange. So I think it's just, I'm curious if you could mention that, something that, any reflections you have.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that a lot of people, whether it's generational trauma or poverty or whatever it is, are disempowered from inherent birthright allies. And every being on the planet shares different allies, but access to these, everyone has different medicines. And I think, one of the things I learned in reading Leah Pettibon's Farming While Black, she talked about how people who are descendants of slaves often didn't want to work with the earth because of their DNA, connection to the earth until they did ceremony and reconnected, and then was like, whoa, because if those people, all the ones we know that haven't yet been empowered in the way they deserve to be, they're so much more dependent upon the system, and they're so much more docile, and they're less empowered and so much more dependent upon the pharmaceutical and the food industry and the whole chain. But it's really a step in liberation, is helping everyone connect to the natural world, learn about the medicines, learn about the food, learn about the rhythms, and then slowly we can unplug from that and plug into the earth and then take care and grow more. And while we do that, we're also creating pollinator habitat, growing soil sponges, protecting the watershed, and taking care of each other. And children growing up with this, they're empowered, and because there's so much more power, and it's like we're missing half our team. More than half of our team is the non-human part of the world. And if we're missing half our team, we're not going to go very far.
But I'm curious if you could make just a brief mention of some of the work you do with younger people, students, youth more broadly. Maybe some of the work you've done with just either bringing them into spaces they've never been, some of your educational work.
Yeah, so I miss that so much right now because I'm doing so much research right now in earthworks, but that is so important and I love it, and spent a lot of my adulthood working with youth, both elementary school, middle school, and high school, and homeschool, right? And even actually a bunch of homeschool kids came and helped during COVID for physically distant work parties. And, a lot of those years I was teaching earth awareness activities. I used to run an environmental education program for Waldorf School before I was a science teacher. And, just having kids have a sit spot, even if it's just a tree in the backyard, having time every day for the children to just be outside in nature, feeling safe, getting drawn to what they want to get drawn to, and developing the love, because we take care of things we love. And with technology today and all the chemicals, I don't know if children are spending as much time as we did when we were children. But that's been just so amazing, because they're really the teachers. Once I'm out there with them, they see and hear and tune into all these other things that I'm just walking right by. And, when I used to teach about before you harvest, give a piece of your hair, give a song or blessing, and ask the plant, is it okay? And that adults are like, plants talk. But kids are like, oh yeah, of course plants talk. Oh yeah, and this idea of course we're going to take something from it, we got to give it back. And first, give an offering and see if we're allowed. And so I think that working with children is just so important and so nourishing, and they need us and their teachers because they're closer to the source in certain ways.
Incredibly humbling in my own experience working with younger folks, keeping me on my toes.
Yeah.
Just a question that Jesse has, actually. If you could, I know you're coming from less of an urban space than I'm talking from right now. If you could describe the fungal system that we have, if there is anything to note in a larger city like DC, either to mention like the state we are now, or maybe some of the harms that have been done in such an urban space to the fungal system.
Yeah, I think in terms of the mycorrhizae networks, they've probably been ripped up and don't exist too much there. There's certainly probably a lot of saprophytes. Saprophytes are the fungi that eat dead wood, like oysters and reishi. And so you might see those on logs, and those are actually really easy ones that you can do, in urban areas, is you can inoculate logs, and with the wood chips, you can put those saprophytes. If you have an area in DC where you are rewilding, like a empty lot, you could get the mycorrhizae going there. And obviously you want to do testing to see about the heavy metals. But yeah, once you bring in fungi and watch what they do and see who shows up, you learn a lot. Certain fungi will show up when there's a major toxin, and they're indicators of that toxin. And then because the toxin to them is food. You might see a lot of shaggy mane in DC. You might see a lot of stinkhorns. Trying to think of fungi I saw in New York City. Yeah, so I think that's a really great opportunity to both cultivate and grow there, figuring out which substrates, and then also see who's showing up.
I'm curious, just briefly, do you have any reference books you recommend, or just broader literature you could recommend?
Yes, I do. So one of them is Radical Mycology. This book, I highly recommend it. And It's got a good amount of pages, but it's got really good technical information and philosophical information. So Radical Mycology. Another great book that's a little less scientific, but a great starter, I'm just going to get a few, is by Paul Stamets. You probably heard of him maybe, called Mycelium Running. And that's this. And you know, in certain scientific circles, there's a little scrutiny, but it's very foundational. Really important, great work. Paul Stamets. Another amazing book that I really love, called Earth Repair by Layla Darwish. Again, it's not scientifically rigorous, and she would be the first to admit it. She's a wonderful activist, but it has incredible stories of Earth repair and a lot of important work to kind of tips to know about. And then if you actually want to cultivate and you know, get going with that, one of the books, I can't find it right now, but it's by Trad Cotter. Oh, here it is. It's called Organic Mushroom Farming and Mycoremediation. It's a really helpful book. It has a lot of technical information, even how to, that's how we built our lab and different species. It also has a whole list of species that no one's done research on yet, that he's like, these are remediators. We need people to do pilot projects. And another great book, if you're kind of like heady and you don't mind Grateful Dead language, is Mycorrhizal Planet. Really brilliant. This man, Michael Phillips, was an apple grower. He's one of the first stone crop growers in the Northeast that didn't use chemicals. And it has great tips for using mycorrhizae for growing perennials. Yeah, and then another geeky one that just has a lot of good technical information is The Fifth Kingdom by Bryce Kendrick. I'm loving it. Has really good info. And I'm sure there's a lot more. There's a book called Teaming with Fungi that's really good by Jeff Lowenfalls. And Farming the Woods. That one is by Gabriel. I don't know where it went, but that's a good one too if you want to learn how to actually start a business growing fungi. And they started a program at Cornell University. Oh, here it is. Farming the Woods. Ken Mudge and Steve Gabriel. And it has really good techno. I think I read something that your logs didn't work or someone's logs didn't work. So it gives a lot of good technical information. Also about bringing in other species like ducks that might eat slugs.
And we have another question here from Sarah, more related to compost. It says, how do you know if our compost is creating runoff, maybe specifically phosphorus or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I assume you're referring to compost that you put in your gardens and not your compost pile. Maybe I'm wrong. Feel free to type if I'm wrong, but I'll try to answer it for both scenarios. A good way to check is when it rains, at least for overland flow, you know, going out and seeing where the water runs and if the water is like running not clear. But in terms of subsurface flow, which is a reality too, you could do some testing further down. You know, if you find an outlet and you could do some testing, you could do testing in soil further down, and you could even dig down. I don't know how the soil is, but there's something called redox features where the soil gets modeled and it's where the water table is, and it's depending on the type of soil and where you are, how deep it is. And then you could pull up water and test that for phosphorus. So a couple different ways, but also just look at it and try to cover it. You don't want to ever have exposed soil. And so if you have a ground cover, you've got wood chips, you know, or you have a bunch of different low herbaceous species, then you're less likely in a big rainstorm to have any runoff. And if you have good soil sponge, it'll percolate and go deep down and hopefully then get exchanged where it needs to go. That's a great question.
And I'm just curious if you can, you mentioned covering the soil in the area where I'm calling from. It gets pretty hot sometimes. It gets pretty sunny. And for a lot of this bare soil, I feel so bad for anything that's trying to live in that soil, plant or any life in general, because it's just this bare exposed to the sun for more than 8 hours a day. I'm curious if you have any recommendations for gardeners or, you know, home gardeners, etc.
Yeah, so one of my favorite people and mentors, friend and colleague, Kat Buxton, I highly recommend checking out the Healthy Soils Coalition. She always talks about this, and other teachers of hers, just keep soil covered. Biomass becomes your friend. I have friends now that, like, anytime you see a pile of wood chips or leaves, you're like, oh, it's so valuable. It really is. Because if you think about it, any microbe, or you wouldn't be able to just, like, maybe you could live in the desert. There's people that do. The Bedouins figure out how, but they have to wear layers and keep under tents and trees, and they're careful. And it's hard for microbes. You want to have a rich microbial diversity. There's more creatures in 1 teaspoon of soil than humans on the planet if you have healthy soil. But if it's exposed to the sun and the wind, they're not going to be able to survive. And so you want to always keep it covered. And you don't have to go buy fancy this from some store. You could just, when the fall comes, save all the leaves, or if you find a tree got cut down, and grab the wood chips, or if there's straw, or if you have to have a lawn and you scythe it, or the lawnmower, or whatever, once it dries and turns brown, or if you do weed, you can lay the plants that you pulled out right back on the soil. It's called, or cut them. It's called chop and drop. I do want to just reference the field of permaculture, which has been so helpful and formative to me. And there's a lot of great books like Forest Gardening, and a lot of great books that talk about techniques in order to do that, and also planting in a way that you don't have exposed soil. If you look at those empty lots in DC where plants are coming in, they end up coming at different heights and end up covering it sometimes.
It's frustrating just as a landscaper in the city, seeing all of that organic decomposable material just bagged up and removed from the city, removed from the neighborhoods where they're produced. So frustrating.
You have to go out at midnight, Extension Rebellion with their bike brigades, and go on biomass, dumpster dive biomass.
Biomass recovery. Yes, please.
Yes.
This is my quiet plug. If anyone's interested in doing that, please message me. Well, as of now, I'm just incredibly grateful, Jess, for all the wisdom that you shared, just all the insights that you've given us here. I'm curious, just as we're moving to the end, if you have any final reflections, any collaborators you want to, lift up in this space. And generally, we've talked about, ecological reconciliation. We've talked about decolonization strategies. We've talked about many weighty topics. I wonder if you have just any closing statements, any ways to really keep us inspired as we're navigating some new and troubling waters.
Thanks. I think that tuning into people who are actively fighting the extractive economy, and also people in the healing community. All of my friends who are healers, who are herbalists, who are massage therapists, who are somatic healers, dance teachers, yoga teachers, as long as it's not culturally appropriating, rabbis, ministers, people who are spiritual leaders, the cultural storytellers. These are the people that are going to guide us through these times. COVID seems to me to be a harbinger of the human part of the 6th great extinction. We are in the 6th great extinction. It's happening at an unprecedented rate. It's caused by our species. We're starting to feel what other creatures have been feeling since maybe the dawn of agriculture, depending on when you say it started. And so these people are keeping our spiritual microbiome alive, and our own connecting with our ancestors. I think that's just so important, because it's so easy to feel the pain and see what's going on and the toxicity, and remember that we can go in and remediate, partnering, but we have to return to rest and recover and receive teachings, and then see people who are putting their lives on the line. And groups like Food Not Bombs, and groups who are fighting, collaborating with more creative forms of Black Lives Matter, that are really like actively moving land, moving money, moving resources, and all these neighborhood groups that are saying, let's create neighborhood schools for the kids this fall, and people coming out of the woodwork with their skills. I think our networks, the grassroots communities, are really where we can stay strong and connected, and pull more people in, empower them, and help people discover their gifts. And the elders, they are really supposed to be the center They've been here the longest, and they have wisdom, and often they need us to push them in the center and put a mic in their hand and ask them the right stories and the right questions, because the way our society is treating them, they're often pushed to the side. But without them, we're lost.
I'm going to have to end this Zoom call. And once again, enormous gratitude, Jess, for you, for joining us, teaching us. And thank you all. Gratitude for everyone here who's joining live, and ideally folks who are watching in the future.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, everyone. And yay, Earth Team.